Thank you for coming tonight for joining us on a Monday evening. I'm Dr. Natalia Budalo. I'm the chair of the Department of Recreation and Parks Management. So today, what we have for you today is a talk for the William M. Wellner Distinguished Scholar Program. And this is truly a very special event for our department. And I will speak a little bit about who William M. Wellner was. She was a teacher and a coach and an advisor and an administrator here at Frostburg State University. She actually worked here for 32 years. 16 years she was in the department working as a teacher, and for 16 years she actually served as the registrar for the college. It was Frostburg State College at that time. She taught health and physical education. She coached play day and sport day teams. And she actually initiated the Women's Recreation Association, a program for intramural participation in sports. So she was definitely kind of a pioneer in some of the initiatives that we've seen actually continuing now here at Frostburg State University. So the Wellner Scholar was established in March 25 of 1985. It's actually 40 years ago. We're not in March, April, but pretty close. So 40 years ago. So this is pretty much an anniversary here. And actually, Randy, if you want to show this, I brought in the program that they had in 1985 that actually includes kind of a description of Lillian Wellner and the talk at that time. And actually, we're just laughing. The talk at that time was from a faculty from North Carolina Central University in 1985. So the faculty that have continued this over the years. But the program, and I will read exactly what was actually said in the program at that time. What was the intent of this program? The intent of the Distinguished Scholar Program is to provide an opportunity for faculty and students enrolled in the programs of the division to meet outstanding individuals in the profession who might stimulate them in their professional development. So Dr. Rasul Mowatt, thank you for being here, and we are looking forward to stimulating that intellectual curiosity tonight. So the programs that are supported currently by the Wellner Scholar are Recreation and Parks Management, the Athletic Training Program, Exercise Sports Science, and the Health and Physical Education Program. So on a rotation basis, each of us have to have the opportunity to actually host the Wellner Scholar. Tonight, I just want to briefly say thank you to everyone that helped making this event happen. The faculty in the department, Dr. Barrett and Dr. Clements, the students, the Recreation and Park Management student ambassadors, Faith, Caleb, Kayla, Savannah, Harrison, and Jackson. You're here. I know you're here. And our administrative assistant, Jennifer, she's been very instrumental in helping making this event happen. And of course, I want to thank everybody that's here. And of course, President Smith, thanks for joining us. Provost Will, thank you for being here. And we have Dean Singh as well, and Associate Dean Asraf. So thank you all for joining us. Without any further ado, actually, I'm going to invite Faith, one of our students, and she's going to actually introduce Dr. Mowatt. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Rasul Mowatt is currently the Department Head of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management in the College of Natural Resources and Affiliate Professor in Sociology and Anthropology at North Carolina State University. He completed both his Master's of Science degree in Park and Natural Resource Management at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he previously completed a Bachelor's of Arts in History, North and East African, Early American History. He continued his studies at the University of Illinois for a PhD in leisure behavior directly following his master's degree. The combination of these studies informed his dissertation work on looking at the nature and relationship between leisure, natural built environment, and race via lynching history and photography. His interests and concerns are strongly centered on critiquing society for issues that are more prevalent in impacting quality of life. Professor Mowatt has presented his work in more than 10 countries and has published his various leisure and tourism-related publications, as well as in other fields. His primary areas of research include geographies of race, geographies of violence and threat, the animation of public space, and critical leisure studies. In his spare time, he has enjoyed DJing as an art form, spinning house, hip hop, reggae, and electronic music for more than 25 years. He wholeheartedly reflects quite often on a quote from Octavia Butler's Parable of Sower: "All that you touch, you change. All you change changes you." Welcome to Frostburg State, Dr. Mowatt. We are excited to hear your presentation and learn from your expertise. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody. Looking forward to this exchange. Again, thanks to Dr. Buddha, Dr. Clemens, in particular for reaching out, years of engagement at Academy Leisure Science conferences and the like. But I'm looking forward to this conversation here. So that's an agreement that we're going to have a conversation, right? Yes, yes. So that means that, as I kind of go along, even though there's time set aside at the end for question and answer, but please feel free. Let's treat it like a class in a good way. So just raise your hand if there's something that comes up on the screen that you want to get some clarity on. That's including faculty and administrators too, if you all would like to ask any questions up here. Also, if you need to take pictures or whatever else, screenshots, I'm sure that there's aspects probably of the assignment for the class, maybe. Feel free to do so. You ready? I have so many slides here, so we'll see. We'll see if we can get through all of it. But thank you very much. A lot of this is built upon some previous work. This is not a plug to buy my books, but you can if you would like to. But let's get into what I'll attempt to go over with the range of information here, and we'll see what we can get through. The first sort of area I want to kind of go over is just giving redlining a context. How many of you ever heard of redlining before? Right? And I'm assuming that nobody wants to be put on the spot about what you know about it, right? Everybody's looking away. Okay. What about, and then we're going to go on to then some related issues tied to redlining, both directly connected to it and then somewhat happening at the exact same time. And want to sort of deal with more present day sort of responses to what redlining has produced, or more importantly, what has overall housing discrimination has produced. Everybody's with me? I mean, I can't change the slides, but I always like to just make sure that everybody's with me when I, just do this. So first part, redlining and context. If you all don't mind, those of you who said you do, this is not to put you on the spot. I just want to kind of get a sense of what you've heard about redlining, because oftentimes there are misconceptions, there's over assumptions. So anybody wish to sort of volunteer from those of you who raised your hand? Yeah. Okay. So keep that in mind when we sort of look at these maps, if people are being grouped there or if people are already there. Right? Anybody else in terms of thoughts, misconceptions, your conceptions? Of, so insurance. So keep that in mind. Like how insure a house, especially due to damages, or insuring the house, especially in relationship to determining the value. All right. So by definition, and what I mean by definition doesn't mean that this is actually what was done, but what people say when they mean redlining is the practice of financial lenders that you see not granting loans, right? Both home as well as commercial loans. That's not quite exactly what redlining is, and so we're going to go through that. But this is what people understand it to be. It was coined as a phrase by John McKnight back in 1960, and really it kind of came out as a thing to discuss not until the 80s. Right? So McKnight actually finds these maps, right, in the archives, and he begins to question what these maps are saying and where they're from and so forth. He didn't have all the information, but he did have something to kind of begin to sort of treat this because these maps were pretty much hidden, right? Dusty archives somewhere. It's not until Jackson in this particular article in Crabgrass Frontier that redlining as a term is then used and more so used to talk about overall housing discrimination. But I argue here there's a lot more than just housing discrimination, and we'll get to that. So, who created redlining maps? The federal government, specifically through the Federal Home Loan Banks, the FHL banks. There's actually one in Pittsburgh, so Pittsburgh is one of the cities for the FHL banks. And they created these maps for, as you see, roughly about 239. Some files say 250, but only roughly about 220 maps are currently sort of available for most cities. I'm not going to go through all those maps. I just want to kind of give you the number. Um, and the FHL banks, these are the banks that actually set the standards for how to provide loans, and they still exist. So there's 11 of them throughout the country. These are all the locations. The ones closest to me are in Atlanta and then, of course, North Carolina. It serves North Carolina, but it's out of Atlanta. But as you see down, Pittsburgh services both Philadelphia as well as West Virginia. What did they actually display? Um, Anybody remembers what they displayed? Those of you who know what's on there. So I know I had one response about concentrations of population. Anybody else have any clue about what they showed? Kind of, yeah, go ahead. Okay. Is that a guess or is that like something you're like absolutely I know this? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. And that's kind of why it's given that term. But so specifically, the maps display these grades, 4 grades. Um, A is green, and so the area is shaded as green in this particular city. Also, the cities are roughly 500,000 people or more, so it wasn't really smaller cities than that were green line or red line. And then grade B, which is the next best area, is blue. Grade C is yellow as one of the beginning worst areas or bad areas, and then the red, the grade D. So that's all that the maps actually specifically show are these sort of color coded and sort of grades within each. With these neighborhoods were comprised with each of these areas. You also get a sense of other amenities within areas because the maps aren't the only thing that was produced by this effort. And I think what you were talking about is the area description reports. So every map had an area description report, and I'll show you in a second what they look like. But first, just kind of tease you and give you some sense of maps, right? Baltimore, this is what it would look like. So you see the color codes, red, yellow, green, blue. Many of you are from Baltimore. So anything about some of these areas that are color coded? Yeah. The yellow and red. Yep, yep. Anything else from the color code for those of you who are familiar with Baltimore? Yeah, 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 yeah. Right, right. Yeah. No. So understand that this map is from 1934. Like this is not a map from the present day. So keep that in mind in the sense that people are speaking from present day sort of arrangements that are still in existence from this time period, right? But what I'm sort of speaking to is probably how some of these areas not were necessarily established, but firmly sort of kept or locked in place. Pittsburgh as well, nearby. Any of y'all from Pittsburgh area? We don't have to talk about Pittsburgh, but you can see on the map, and if you have any familiarity with Pittsburgh, the color codes should also still make sense and still be relevant in the present day. I'm from Chicago, and and the Chicago map is actually split in two. So this is the first section of the map, which is featuring just south of downtown and then upwards to the north side as well as to the west. And then map 2 provides the remaining part of the south side to the border of Indiana and outward. Any of you are familiar with Chicago at all? Of course I'm not. Yeah. But we know that these maps really reflect still present day circumstances as well. So that's really what's interesting still about these maps. Every single city, every single one, at least the ones I've seen, and I've looked at roughly about 170 so far, the areas still reflect the sort of narrative from these maps. Durham, you even familiar with North Carolina at all? And there's like some other university that's in Durham that, they lost or something. Yeah. But these areas also reflect it. If you're thinking about where Duke is where the green area A2 is, and C1, right? So Duke is kind of like being hugged by those two areas. I'm going to come back to Durham with another map, a little bit later on, but you'll see some additional relationships. So what's really more important than the maps? Because what's interesting is the maps were never publicly available, right? So although they're produced by the FHL banks, no one ever had possession of these outside of the FHL banks at all. No one else received these maps. These maps weren't like passed on or given to anyone. Only 2 maps were made, per city, and they were pretty much kept in the archives. So it was really an internal sort of tool to inform their agency. But it really informed then the writing of what's known as the underwriting manual. This is the manual that then real estate developers would use to do evaluation. So the manual is actually worse than the maps. And so this is the language from the 1936 manual. Take a second to read it. So this is the wording for the act in 1936, and then underneath it is then the actual manual that's then made by the new agency called the Federal Housing Authority, FHA. So read the short quote in the last bullet. The maps were made in 2 phases, one in 1934, and then the second, 1938, 1939. And that was it. They stopped making these particular maps. This is what an area description report looked like. So again, every single map, every color area that was color coded had these area description reports. So if there was 9 color coded areas for a city, there would be 9 area description reports. And the area description reports oftentimes is what people forget or don't look at. What do they say? I know it's kind of blurry. Can you all see that a little bit more? So they described a number of things like what's favorable, public parks, restricted covenants, which we'll get to what they are, adequate utilities, zone for single family, and minimum lot 75 foot So this is, again, what the area description reports would contain. These are for one area that's grade D, and the other one is grade A for Durham. And what we're going to do is look at then grade. Oh, okay, I was like, I'm sorry if I offended somebody. Yeah. So grade D. Take a look at then what they say for grade D. Everybody can read the text. I know it's kind of like blurry type text. So again, area description reports would describe everything, the number of houses, an estimation of how many people lived in the area, and then they would describe the people in some particular way, and then they would file it. Right? So let's get to then related issues. And what I mean by related issues is what I alluded to about the restrictive covenant. So there are things that actually happened way before. So oftentimes what people think with redlining is that it produced housing discrimination. Housing discrimination existed already before that. And so what we're going to do is look at some things that existed before it, but then also look at some things that happened after the redlining maps. Again, Chicago is not because I have a bias, it's just a helpful thing to look at because Chicago is one of the areas that had a very sort of extensive restrictive covenants. So what restrictive covenants actually looked like is this. Basically, there was a law that was then set up that would then determine which population could live where, right? So by law, as well as by, real estate, right? So it would be a dual thing where a law was set up, and then real estate developers then would then sort of adhere to that law. So it was an agreement in most cases. You would be fined if you violated that law. So if you own property, so if you're white and you own property and you lease to somebody who is not white, you could be sued, right, for violating the law. So this is how intense the restrictive covenants were. Every city that had restrictive covenants, they had different types of groups that they would put into the restrictive covenants. So Houston would have a different makeup, oftentimes than what Chicago would restrict, right, or what LA would restrict. So in Chicago, you would see a lot of language around Jewish populations and Black populations. In Houston, you would see a lot of sort of rhetoric around, of course, Black populations, but also both Indian as well as Mexican populations. And then, of course, in Los Angeles, you'll see Armenian, Mexican, as well as Black populations be a part of the language and restrictive covenants. What are restrictive covenants? They would appear in different ways on a mortgage sheet. How many of you are in an apartment currently at all? So the part where it says no pets or what's the rules with pets, that would be where the restrictive covenant language would be at. And so when you signed it, you would then basically you would have to agree to the terms for it. And again, it was about both purchase, renting, as well as allowing people even to stay overnight. So the restrictive covenants involved all of that. You can go ahead and read here in terms of Chicago, at least in one period of time that Chicago had this particular language. They always modified it. But go ahead and take a look. Good. Right. Again, remember, if there's questions, stop me, please, please. All right. So this preceded redlining and actually had far greater impact than the redlining, specifically in Chicago. For those of us who are familiar with Chicago, if you hear about Chicago, you hear about people with Chicago, but really intense about the South Side, West Side sort of dynamic. It is set up by the restrictive covenants, actually. So what we know of in terms of how people think about South Side, West Side of Chicago becomes a thing because of the restrictive covenants. This also involved other types of maps that would sort of explain population representation. Some cases, the maps weren't used for anything other than just sort of trying to count people. So in this case, this was just an internal city census map, but focused on one population. But coming back to restrictive covenants, so once the law was in place, and it did not actually stay up as a legal law for too long. Only about 6-7 years did it sort of exist. It was quickly found to be unconstitutional, but people still operated with the restrictive covenants. And so you would see then the language in these advertisements and still within the sort of agreements for mortgages and rent. So this would be an advertisement for coming to, trying to buy property in the subdivision, and they would have the term zoned and restricted. If you understood what restricted mean, you would know what it would be. So it wouldn't say outright who was excluded in certain cases. It would just use that language. Does that make sense? But in other cases, it may say something outright, right? So here in this particular case, where it's highlighted, it says colored people excluded, right? So it really depends on which city, where, and that also included actual physical signs out. Some of us are old enough that we may have seen some of these signs in our early years. I know I may not look that old, but I am, But this would be something that you would see. And again, the terms protected was alluding to the connection to restricted, because of course, again, it was made unconstitutional. So people could not outright still carry out the restricted covenant language and policies. I know you can't see everything on here, but here's a passage from this particular homeowners association telling a new resident, a new neighbor, that they have to sign the association agreement, or pretty much or else. Right? So just kind of read the language here, what they're trying to make this person do because they moved in. Some went as far as developing sort of their own mapping. Some of these neighborhood associations went as far as that, but they would still have this sort of articulated language. So coming back to some examples, again, of context of how things went a little bit further. This kind of gives you a layout of Durham, again, with the colors of the redlining, but with now some markers of things. So you see the different Duke campuses, you see where a key hospital is at in relationship to some of the color-coded areas. And you see 1925 again. This is what I think is also important about dispelling certain things, certain aspects of the redlining maps, because again, sometimes people are bringing in restrictive covenants, sort of actions or weight into the redlining maps, and it was really the restrictive covenants that actually played a far, far, far greater role. I'm going to give you some examples now of both impacts of several different types of maps and how they may sort of play out in the present day. So it's sort of connecting to some of the points about concentration and also what you see in Baltimore. Right? So Indianapolis is one of the places I was at previously because of Indiana University. This is an area, as you can see, that showcases um, two actually cemeteries, one major one and then one small one in the corner. This is a map in 1915. These were called Sanford fire insurance maps. So this company created all these maps for all these cities to basically determine fire insurance specifically. They didn't really have any language tied to housing discrimination. It was solely about the sort of like properties of the house. What was it made out of wood? Was it reinforced with cement and these types of things? What was it made out of? Moving right into the 1930s and the redlining, the area that has the cemetery. So it's considered in one of the grade D areas. Another type of map, the Blaze map. Um, what you see now, do you see a cemetery anymore? Okay. You see a lot of railroad tracks, right? Any assumption about what was probably there because of all those railroad tracks? Any guesses? Hmm? Yeah, any factory? So it's a factory. It's called Diamond Chain. It was a major sort of manufacturing company that went through different phases. But where's the cemetery? Hmm. Yes, they built on top of it, right? But people completely forgot that it was there. Great segue. So, um, Indianapolis is a sports town. You have Indy 500, the Brickyard, Colts, Indianapolis Colts. You have a minor league baseball team. You have the Indianapolis Pacers there. They have a burgeoning soccer club, Indianapolis 11, and they want to build a stadium downtown. Um, and the stadium is going to go where the old Diamond Chain was at. You see the area again, right? 11 Park. So it's not just a stadium; it's the whole sort of nowadays it's more than a stadium. It'll be probably a mixture of apartment complexes, amusement related entertainment district. This is what it would look like. Ooh, lights. Your segue for the cemetery. Um, Through construction and digging to build the stadium, what did they find? Um, Bones, bodies, caskets. Luckily, when one of the workers found that and contacted, the appropriate sort of authorities, everything halted. So clearly, in the past, that didn't happen. And so, what they had to do was, excavate the land, determine the degree of how many bodies were still present there, reintern them somewhere else, contact family members if they're still alive and present, compensation. It's a headache just to think about what it could be. But all because they ignored all these city maps. These maps were not hidden. Like these maps were in the Historical Society for Indianapolis, and this is the actual configuration. The biggest disturbance of the cemetery grounds was where they would call the Negro burial ground in particular. Um, so the red area uh, was the most disturbed, but the whole area had been pretty much disturbed. So this is one clear example of how important, like in a totally different way, that these types of maps could be. Right? They can both erase something, or they can sort of keep us into the know of something and do something more with it, something else. So now, yeah, go ahead. Say it again. that's what they've been doing now, right? So they have to figure out forensics, like whose body, in certain cases, whose body is whose, because in some cases, it's not like the plot has been undisturbed, right? And so it's not as easy as, oh, there's still a headstone underneath this cement, right? In other cases, bodies were just because of maybe income status they weren't able to afford, so sometimes bodies were just thrown in pits, right? So they have to now figure out, yeah, exactly, just how many, yeah. So that's what they're in the process of doing. They're not finished yet. This is how fresh this is. This is last year. This is last year. Right? So the entire, of course, construction is stopped. Part of the issue is preventing sort of a rubber stamp, so still building the stadium and just having some type of memorial plaque saying, here was the old cemetery. So you really do have to reinturn the dead somewhere. You have to put them into another cemetery someplace, somewhere in the city. I saw another hand. Yeah, last year. The last year in terms of discovery. So the area is not, of course, redlining, but redlining clearly tells us probably how. Well, I guess I'm jumping the gun, and it's okay. I mean, I don't have to stick to my plan. I made all these pretty slides, but and so I argue that we have inappropriately called these redlining maps, and when what they really are green lining maps, or because more importantly, what did they establish? They established a way to arbitrarily not just lower the value of a property, but increase the value of a property. Most cases we think increasing the property, especially a home, put a new roof, put a fence on. That's how you sort of increase the value. But no, in this case, they can increase the value of property in the entire area because the process that redlining undertook, having somebody go there, walk around, became now the de facto process of creating those values, right? So this is why you see certain home areas, $1 million, $2 million, 3 million or more, right? New York, Billionaires Row. Why is it Billionaires Row? That's an arbitrary thing. It wasn't always Billionaires Row. So the redlining allowed for the property value to go down to probably entice the diamond chain company to actually even get the property for cheap, right? Um, well, worse than because it's a factory, right? So it's not even gentrifying area. It's just having heavy industry in the area, but there's still homes. There's still a neighborhood around the factories, and so you can imagine what the water quality was like, or the air quality in the area is like, and that's the redlining, right? It's more than just the home or the value of the home that's impacted. It all of a sudden just made the area sort of disregarded. But for real estate developer, that's great because you can entice people to purchase, right? If you're trying to get business, if you don't want Diamond Chain to go to Cincinnati, you would have a lower price value on the property in Indianapolis. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Yeah. No, yeah, no, not at all. It was more about protection of value, right? Not really moving people in and out. But this did lock certain types of neighborhoods to be certain things, in particular, setting the value for them. So in Baltimore, now all of a sudden the area that's just north of the Raven Stadium is now prime real estate and it's undergoing gentrification, even though it was once red. Um, but they had to attract buyers. And so they could not have the price value of green and blue area. They had to keep it red to entice all that business to sort of, come into the area. Does that kind of make sense? And so that's why I think of them more as green lining maps and not red lining. We've been focusing on the wrong thing in certain cases. Here's some other examples. Durham. So you remember this sort of makeup. Here's another map of Durham for the Department of Public Works. Department of Public Works also handles parks and so forth. The map shows both playgrounds in areas based upon race. They only reflected, two racial groups in the maps in Durham. So the boat, I know you may not be able to see the wording, but just think about the bolded line areas are the neighborhood areas predominantly black. What's interesting is in the parks and the areas that are bolded darker, they're incinerators. Now, some of us are old enough to know what incinerators are. Some of you may not ever have heard or seen, but those of you who still probably have seen incinerators, basically in the neighborhood area, it was a place where you brought all your trash, you dumped it into a pit that was constantly on fire and would burn your trash in there. And of course, there's a tower with smoke to burn it. So there's four incinerators in Durham. Three are in the bolded black areas, dark areas in the park, in a park. And then the one area that is predominantly white, this was a white immigrant community. That's where the fourth one is. St. Louis. Anybody here familiar with St. Louis at all? Probably one of the worst stories, actually. So St. Louis, you get a sense here. This map is in the wrong direction, so think about north being you all's right. So that's north. So it's just sort of like being shown in this particular angle. It's interesting because St. Louis redlining map also showcases areas that were deemed as blight, right? So blight was an area, a term that was used to determine what place that building should be knocked down, right, and completely sort of removed. So you see the red areas still in the same redlining areas, and sure enough, one of the most major sort of displacement areas, 1954, Mill Creek Valley, 20,000 people who lived in the area, not all black, predominantly, but not all, were displaced in a matter of 4 days, completely removed from Mill Creek area. And Mill Creek area was flattened, supposedly for redevelopment, and they've only started to redevelop in the present day. So the plans that they had for development never were even executed in terms of the apartments, the parks, and so forth up until the present. This is a thing that just was shown in maps in 2019, and it's just now being built. It's still not finished, but parts of it have been finished. So this area was pretty much displaced for no reason. And then Los Angeles. I'm going to skip Los Angeles for the sake of time to get to some other particular points, but everybody's with me, right? Yeah. Doesn't mean that we have to get through every single slide. I mean, I was a madman just making all this. I don't know what I was thinking, but it kind of gives a lot of different information. One example of redlining maps, how especially in Los Angeles, it would again identify areas that were red for easy sort of sale of property. Chavez Ravine was predominantly sort of Mexican American homeowners that were restricted covenants. So this was the only area that they could sort of buy land and build homes in. Eventually, they were completely sort of displaced for the sake of building the Los Angeles Dodger Stadium. First phase, they were displaced for the promise of developing public housing, which didn't make any sense. They already had a house, but there was a plan to build public housing. So a third of the population was displaced for the public housing development that never happened. And then the remaining community members were displaced for the building of the Los Angeles Dodgers when it moved from New York. was on them to find a place to go. There's pictures that you can see where literally homeowners were dragged out of their house. You actually see them being dragged out the house. And then right after they're dragged out, bulldozers just knocking out their house. So it's not even like, time lapse to, several hours later. They'll literally, you see the video, they're pulling the older woman out, and then the bulldozer is knocking the house down. No, the first phase they were, but it was not the value of their home. So the first phase, when I was saying about the public housing, so it was an interesting dynamic where the two political parties were in competition or argument with each other. So the Democratic Party there in Los Angeles was trying to push for massive public housing. Again, the residents were like, why do we need public housing? Like, we have a house. Like, why, right? And then, and while the Republican Party there was trying to attract new business, and so that's when they began to be sort of courted by Branch Rickey, who was the owner of the Los Angeles Dodgers, who wanted to leave New York because New York wouldn't build him a new stadium. And so he moves the Dodgers to LA, but he gets this prime land for like $10. It was like a handshake agreement. So the present day Dodger Stadium is Chavez Ravine. It's still present there. Another example is Miami. Anybody here familiar with Miami? Who wants to admit being familiar with Miami? All right, okay. What's interesting about Miami is not just the redlining, but they went as far as actually creating physical divisions with the actual color-coded areas. And so you can see aspects of the walls still in the present day, not completely. Some parts of them have been demolished. But next time, if you ever get a chance to go or admit that you actually went there for spring break or something like that, just drive around Miami, and you'll see some parts of it, right, all across the city. In some cases, it would look like this: a median that was impossible for people to walk across with traffic. So there's no crosswalk or anything. So it's this pretty much 18, 20-inch high sort of median. So only certain type of people could probably cross over that. In other cases, it was an outright wall. In more present day, they've made openings for people to kind of cross over, but in the past, there would be no sort of opening. So these walls are still present, and it was advertised as a buffer strip, as a way to not only keep the concentration of populations uniquely in certain areas, but also as a way to sort of advertise maintaining home values. So this is why neighborhoods were called what they are. There's Little Havana, there's Little Haiti, right? These names aren't just like clever names because people just like the food of those areas. It's because that's the concentration of people that was there. Phoenix is an interesting case. The red area is, interestingly enough, also downtown. Right? Go figure. But it's also the downtown. Everything in this red area is heavily sort of concrete. Right? So keep that in mind. So the interstate is in this red area in the present day. The airport is in this red area in the present day. So when we think about the heat issues in Phoenix, right? I mean, we know it's hot, but it's getting hotter. Something like 110 days out of the year, it's like 90 plus, right? And it's always increasing in terms of temps. This results in also disparities between present day heat stroke related, deaths and illnesses, but then also where places are cool. So you can already figure out redlining, yellow lined areas hot in the present day, more increased deaths related to heat stroke and so forth. And then green and blue areas, cool, less sort of cases of heat stroke. And you see green space in abundance in the sort of green and blue areas of the city. And then in the other areas, you see the sort of typical sort of barren, sand and of course massive amounts of concrete. So to wrap up, think about some ways to think about solutions. So let me just jump. Here's just also some important points. While, yes, it's true that grade D areas were, of course, representing all of the black neighborhoods, the grade D areas were never 100% black, never, right? And so predominantly in most cities, it would be a mixture of some other population, and some type of other immigrant population, Italian, Irish, depending upon the city. Philly, it would be like Irish and Italian and black. In another particular area, it would be like Cincinnati, it would be German and black. These are the examples of what would be in the red or the yellow areas of every city. Just so you also have the information, and you can feel free to, this is a great resource that has the digital archives of as many maps as possible. I think has maybe 150 or more maps, and also has the area description reports attached to the maps. Um, and as you can see, it charts as much of the country as possible within them. So when you go to the site, it'll provide very accessible information, including history and so forth. Give me the breakdown of demographics of the time, not in the present day. Giving you a more clear write out of what the area description report said for each area. And I just sort of highlighted things that was how park kept coming up as an amenity, as a preferred sort of desirable aspect of an area. Roland Park in particular is one area that really tried to advertise itself as an alternative to the interior part of the city, with paved streets and street lights and so forth. It was part of this sort of movement of creating green cities. But Roland Park is not a city, right? It's just a neighborhood area. But it was fashioning itself as a separate city in many cases. But again, it wasn't just the green, the yellow are sort of highlighted what the concerns were, and then as well as the red areas. So again, very useful site. Highly recommend. Anybody need the QR code again? Anybody? No? Yeah. Let me go back to it. Yep. How useful are these? One particular park district in North Carolina was able to use then these redlining maps to go back to look at allocations for basketball courts, community centers, and so forth to kind of figure out how to create more equitable distribution of certain types of, because you would imagine in green and blue areas there are far more amenities in the parks than in the other areas. In the case of Baltimore, you sort of see this highway of nowhere, and you also see, discussions of new development. This is the highway of nowhere. For those of you from Baltimore, you know about this, but they're in the process of $85 million funded sort of redevelopment of this strip. But of course, the concerns are, yeah, this is incredible in terms of trying to come up with a new sort of idea, but we still have to recognize the damage that was previously done. I think some of you had the questions about, how families were compensated in many cases a law by the name of eminent domain was used. And eminent domain, you don't always have to be compensated. And so this was a functioning community with just this area. And the highway to nowhere is important to notice because it was another example of a project that didn't have to exist. It was never completed. It was never, part of the overall sort of redevelopment of the interstate system coming through the city of Baltimore. But the entire community that was there and that was now chopped up because of the highway nowhere still sort of has the sort of the wounds of that sort of carve up. Other ways in which communities have thought about correcting these things, they've tried to develop what's known as asset maps. You would be surprised how many cities do not really know where their assets are. When I say asset, a pool, a playground, they know it with an address, but they don't have a map. So in certain cases, just having an asset map is important, as well as a complete citywide and countywide asset map. In other cases, creating maps about access, certain districts, departments, they try to push for a playground being every sort of 2-3 blocks of a neighborhood area. Thinking about families who walk with children and so forth. So in many cases, parks departments have not achieved that sort of access to that type of basic recreation, not even a full blown park, just a playground area. This includes trying to map your service area. So how many people actually come to your services or programming or facilities. And then how accessible is this information even online, right? It's one thing to sort of just know this, but can people sort of find it in some regard? So another asset to give you in terms of a QR code is just this particular mapping project, which is about looking at equitable access. So again, here's a QR code, if useful.